The transport ship landed on Prime with a heavy thud that shook every passenger inside. Penny Moore grabbed the edge of her seat and waited for the doors to open. Through the small window, she could see the massive buildings of the Interstellar Combat Academy stretching toward the purple sky. This was the most famous military training center in the entire galaxy. Species from over 200 different worlds came here to become warriors. Penny was 22 years old. She stood 5 feet and 1 inch tall. She weighed 110 pounds. When the doors opened and she stepped out onto the landing platform, she looked like a child standing among giants. A walked past her first. His body was covered in black armor that grew from his own skin. He was nearly 8 feet tall, and his footsteps cracked the metal floor. Behind him came a group of snake-like creatures with powerful tails and scales that shimmered in the light. They moved together like water flowing downhill. Then came the massive beings with 4 arms and bodies built like mountains. One of them looked down at Penny and laughed so hard that spit flew from his wide mouth. Penny said nothing. She held her transfer papers close to her chest and walked toward the registration building. Her pale blue eyes stayed fixed on the path ahead. She had learned long ago that reacting to cruelty only invited more of it. The registration hall was crowded with recruits from every corner of the galaxy. Penny took her place in line behind a who coiled his body to make himself taller. He looked back at her once, made a sound of disgust, and turned away. The line moved slowly. As Penny waited, a named Al pushed through the crowd. He was young for his species but already carried the arrogance of someone who had never been challenged. When he reached Penny's spot in the line, he pretended not to see her at all. He lifted his armored leg and stepped over her head as if she were a piece of garbage on the floor. The aliens around her laughed. Some pointed. A few made comments in languages she did not understand, but the meaning was clear enough. Penny kept her eyes forward and did not react. High above the registration hall, there was an observation deck reserved for senior officers. Commander stood at the railing and watched everything below. He was a species that had earned a terrifying reputation across the galaxy. They were the apex predators, the hunters that other hunters feared. Himself was over 300 years old and had killed creatures on 1,000 different worlds. He stood 8 feet tall with gray skin covered in faint scars. His eyes were yellow with black slits for pupils, and they missed nothing. Right now, those ancient eyes were fixed on the tiny human woman standing in the registration line. Had read her file that morning. He had read every recruit's file, as he did every year, but hers had made him stop and read it twice, then 3 times. Then he had requested the classified documents attached to her name. Penny Moore was born on a farming colony called 442. It was a small world on the edge of human space, home to 12,000 people who grew food for nearby systems. Penny had lived there with her parents and her younger brother until she was 11 years old. Then the Void Swarm came. The Void Swarm was not a species that anyone understood well. They were creatures of living darkness, beings that seemed to absorb light itself. They traveled through space in massive groups and consumed every living thing they encountered. When they arrived at 442, the colony had no chance. The defense forces were destroyed in minutes. The civilians were hunted through the streets and fields like animals. 12,000 people lived on that colony. When the rescue ships finally arrived 19 days later, they found only one survivor. Penny Moore, 11 years old, was discovered in a cave system 3 miles from the main settlement. She was thin, dehydrated, and covered in wounds that had been treated with mud and plant matter. Around the entrance to her cave, the rescue team found the bodies of 3 Void Swarm creatures. She had killed them herself. The report said she had used a broken piece of farming equipment as a weapon. She had made fire from materials she found in the wilderness. She had studied the creatures that hunted her and learned their weaknesses. Then she had used that knowledge to destroy them. She was 11 years old. Had lived for 3 centuries. He had seen warriors from every species the galaxy had produced. He had watched the strongest and bravest beings crumble under pressure, and here was a human child who had done what trained soldiers could not. He watched her now as she finally reached the registration desk. The officer behind the counter was a bored-looking alien who barely glanced at her papers before stamping them and waving her through. Penny took her dormitory assignment and walked away without a word. The other recruits continued to laugh and point as she passed. A made a joke about using her as a cleaning tool. A wondered out loud if she had gotten lost on her way to a children's school. Al, who had stepped over her earlier, announced loudly that humans should not be allowed in the academy at all. Penny heard all of it. Her expression did not change. Leaned forward on the railing and studied her more closely. Most beings showed their emotions on their faces and in their bodies. Fear made them tense. Anger made them clench their fists. Shame made them look at the ground. But Penny showed nothing. Her face was calm. Her body was relaxed. Her eyes moved constantly, taking in everything around her, noting exits and obstacles and the positions of every creature nearby. She was not afraid, she was not angry, she was not ashamed. She was watching, calculating, waiting. Had spent his entire life hunting the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy. He knew what prey looked like. He knew what other predators looked like. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that the tiny human woman walking across the registration hall was not prey. The other recruits saw her size and assumed weakness. They saw her soft skin and assumed vulnerability. They saw her quiet nature and assumed submission. They were fools. Saw the truth. He saw the stillness in her eyes, the patience in her movements, the complete absence of wasted energy. He saw a survivor. He saw a killer. He saw a predator wearing the disguise of prey. For the first time in decades, Commander smiled. This year's recruitment class had just become very interesting. The first week of training at the academy was designed to break the week. The instructors made no secret of this. On the very first morning, the head trainer stood before the assembled recruits and told them plainly that half of them would fail. Some would quit. Some would be carried out on stretchers. Some would simply disappear in the night, too ashamed to face anyone after their failures. By the end of that first week, 17 recruits were gone. With a damaged exoskeleton was sent home after a combat simulation cracked his chest plate. 3 left together after the psychological endurance tests pushed them past their limits. One of the largest in the class broke down crying during a survival scenario and had to be sedated before he hurt himself. Penny Moore failed every physical test they gave her. She could not lift what the lifted. When the weight training scores were posted, her numbers were at the very bottom of the list. She could not run as fast as the. In the speed trials, she finished last by such a wide margin that some recruits had time to rest before she crossed the line. She could not take the same hits as the. In the impact resistance tests, she was knocked down again and again while the armored aliens barely felt the blows. But she never quit. Every morning, Penny was the first one in the training hall. Every night, she was the last one to leave. She worked on her weaknesses with a quiet focus that some mistook for stupidity. Why bother, they asked each other. She would never catch up. She would never be strong enough or fast enough or tough enough. On the third night, Al decided to help her understand this. Penny was alone in the barracks, organizing her equipment for the next day, when the door opened and 7 figures walked in. Al led them. Behind him were 3 other and 3, all recruits who had spent the past week making jokes at her expense. They spread out across the room, blocking the exits. Al walked slowly toward Penny. His black armor reflected the dim lights of the barracks. He was nearly 3 feet taller than her and probably 5 times her weight. When he stopped in front of her, she had to tilt her head back to see his face. "You should leave," Al said. His voice was deep and rough. "You do not belong here. You are too small, too weak, too soft. Go home before you embarrass yourself more." Penny looked up at him. Her face showed no fear. "No." Al made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Then we will help you understand. He raised one clawed hand, ready to strike her. "You're standing wrong," Penny said quietly. Al paused. "What?" "Your weight is on your back leg. Your balance is off. If I wanted to, I could collapse your knee before you even started your swing." For a moment, no one moved. Then Al laughed, loud and cruel, and his cronies laughed with him. The idea that this tiny creature could hurt him was the funniest thing he had heard all week. He never finished laughing. Al woke up in the medical bay 6 hours later. His knee was dislocated. 3 of his thoracic plates were cracked. His head throbbed with pain he could not explain. When he asked the medical officer what had happened, he was told that the security footage from the barracks had shown only static during those crucial minutes. No one knew exactly what had occurred. Al knew. He remembered a blur of movement, a flash of pain, and then darkness. He remembered that the tiny human had moved faster than his eyes could follow. He remembered that she had not hesitated, not even for a second. He told no one what he remembered. The shame was too great. After that night, the bullying stopped. The other recruits still laughed at Penny behind her back, but no one confronted her directly. No one blocked her path or stepped over her head. They gave her space, and though they would never admit it, they watched her with new eyes. Commander had seen everything. He had been watching from the shadows of the barracks, invisible in the darkness as only a could be. He had watched Penny take down Al with 3 precise strikes while the other alien stood frozen in shock. He had watched her drag the unconscious to a recovery position and check his breathing before walking calmly to her bunk and going to sleep. She had not been angry. She had not been scared. She had simply solved a problem with the minimum necessary force. Humans called this dirty fighting, called it something else. They called it efficient. Began appearing during Penny's extra practice sessions. He would arrive without warning and stand at the edge of the training area, watching her work. The first few times, Penny ignored him. She continued her exercises as if he were not there, but did not leave. On the 4th night, he spoke. "Your form is wrong," he said. "You are wasting energy." Penny stopped and looked at him. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then she nodded slowly. "Show me." Stepped onto the training floor. For the next 3 hours, he corrected her stance, adjusted her movements, and taught her techniques that he had never shared with any recruit. He pushed her harder than any instructor had, demanding perfection in every motion, accepting nothing less than her absolute best. When they finished, Penny was exhausted. Sweat soaked her training clothes and her muscles trembled with fatigue, but her eyes were bright. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you helping me?" Studied her for a long moment. "Because you understand something that the others do not. You know that strength is not about size, speed is not about legs, victory is not about power." He paused. "You know that the greatest weapon is the mind, and yours is sharper than any blade I have seen in 300 years. Penny said nothing, but something passed between them in that moment, a recognition between 2 predators who saw the world the same way. The academy buzzed with rumors after that. Why would the legendary commander waste his time on the smallest recruit in history? What did he see in her that no one else could see? Was he testing her, mocking her, using her for some unknown purpose? No one could answer these questions. No one understood. But Penny understood, and for the first time since arriving at the academy, she allowed herself to feel something like hope. She had found someone who saw her clearly, someone who recognized what she really was. Not prey, not victim, not the tiny human everyone laughed at. A predator just like him. The midterm examination was the most feared test in the academy's history. Every year, recruits were taken to Seven, a jungle moon with some of the deadliest wildlife in the known galaxy. They were dropped in teams of 5 and given one simple objective: reach the extraction point on the other side of the continent. They had 7 days. No weapons were provided. No food was given. No help would come unless they activated their emergency beacon, which meant automatic failure. Many recruits had died on 7 over the centuries. The jungle was filled with creatures that hunted anything that moved. The plants themselves were often poisonous or carnivorous. The weather changed without warning, bringing storms that could strip flesh from bone. Only the strongest survived. Penny was assigned to a team with 4. Their names were L, N, X, and they were not the worst recruits in the class, but they were not the best either. They had been grouped together because no one else wanted to work with them. And no one wanted to work with Penny. The transport ship dropped them at the edge of a dense forest as the sun began to set. The team leader, L, gathered everyone together to discuss their strategy. He pointed in the direction of the extraction point and outlined his plan. Move fast, stay together, avoid anything dangerous. Then he looked at Penny. "You will slow us down," he said. His forked tongue flickered in and out as he spoke. "Your legs are too short, your body is too weak, we cannot wait for you." Penny met his eyes without flinching. "I understand." El nodded. "Good, then you understand that we are leaving you behind." The other said nothing. They would not look at her. Within minutes, the 4 snake-like aliens had disappeared into the undergrowth, moving fast on their powerful tails, leaving Penny alone in the darkening jungle. She watched them go and felt nothing but calm. This was not the first time she had been abandoned in a dangerous place. It would not be the last. She knew how to survive. She had known since she was 11 years old. Penny took stock of her surroundings. She noted the direction of the wind, the sounds of the forest, the quality of the soil beneath her feet. She identified 3 different types of plants that could be eaten and 2 that would kill her. She found a source of fresh water within the first hour and spent the night in a tree hollow that protected her from the rain. For 6 days, Penny moved through the jungle like a ghost. She did not try to fight the ecosystem. She became part of it. She covered her scent with mud and plant matter. She moved only when the wind would mask her sounds. She ate what the jungle offered and drank from streams that larger creatures had not claimed. She studied the predators she encountered and learned their patterns, their hunting grounds, their weaknesses. She was small, and in this place, small was an advantage. She could hide where larger beings could not. She could move through spaces that would stop anything bigger. She could survive on less food and less water than any of her teammates. On the 4th day, she found There was a legend even among Seven's many predators. It was 12 feet long, covered in black scales that seemed to absorb light. Its jaws could crush bone like paper. Its claws could tear through starship armor. In the history of the Academy, had killed over 30 recruits. They were considered unstoppable. Penny found this one drinking at a stream. She climbed a tree nearby and watched it for 3 hours. She watched how it breathed deep and slow, with a rhythm that never changed. She watched how it moved, always leading with its left side, favoring its right leg. She watched where its eyes pointed and noticed the blind spots on either side of its massive head. She watched it hunt a smaller creature and saw how it attacked, always lunging forward in a straight line, unable to change direction quickly. By the end of those 3 hours, Penny knew everything she needed to know. She climbed higher into the tree and waited. Eventually, it detected her scent. It circled the base of the tree, growling low in its throat, trying to find a way to reach her. When it realized it could not climb, it settled down to wait. It was patient. It had all the time in the world. Penny had more patience. She waited until the creature was directly beneath her, its attention focused on the trunk of the tree. Then she dropped. In her hands was a branch she had sharpened against a rock. The point was crude but effective. As she fell, she aimed for the soft tissue beneath this jaw, the only place where its armor was thin. Her entire body weight drove the stake upward, through the soft flesh, through the muscle, into the brain. It was dead before it hit the ground. Penny landed beside it and checked to make sure it was not still breathing. Then she sat down, caught her breath, and began the work of removing its teeth. They would make good weapons for the rest of her journey. On the seventh day, Commander arrived at the extraction point in a military transport. He expected to find teams of exhausted recruits waiting for pickup. Instead, he found one small human woman sitting alone on a rock, wearing a necklace made of teeth. "Where is your team?" he asked. "They left me on the first day," Penny said. Her voice was flat, without anger or self-pity. "They activated their emergency beacons on day 3. Checked his records. She was right. Her entire team had failed, rescued after less than half the test was complete. Only Penny had finished." He looked at the teeth around her neck. He knew what creature they had come from. He knew that no recruit had ever killed alone. "How?" he asked. Penny shrugged. "I watched it, I learned it, I killed it." Stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly, he bowed his head in the gesture of respect between equals. It was a gesture he had not used in over a century. It was a gesture he had never used with any human. "You understand," he said quietly, "what it means to hunt." Penny met his ancient eyes without flinching. In her gaze, he saw the same cold patience that lived in his own, the same willingness to wait, to watch, to strike at exactly the right moment. "I've always understood," she said, "since I was 11 years old." Nodded slowly. The tiny human before him had just accomplished something that the strongest warriors in the galaxy had failed to do. She had done it alone, abandoned, with nothing but her mind and her will. He was no longer surprised. He was no longer curious. Now he was certain. This human was something special, something dangerous, something that the galaxy had never seen before. And he would make sure she survived long enough to show everyone what she could do. The final examination was supposed to be the greatest challenge any recruit would face. It was a complex simulation involving space combat, ground assault, and tactical decision-making. Recruits trained for months preparing for it. The scores from this test would determine their future careers in the galactic military. But the final examination never happened. On the morning of the test, the alarm started screaming. Penny was in her barracks when the first warning sounded. It was a high-pitched wail that cut through every room in the academy, a sound that every recruit had been taught to recognize, but hoped they would never hear. It meant that the academy's orbital defenses had been breached. It meant that something hostile had entered the system. It meant that death was coming. Through the windows, Penny could see the sky turning dark. Not the darkness of night, but something else. Something that seemed to swallow the light itself. She knew that darkness. She had seen it before, 11 years ago, on a farming colony that no longer existed. The Void Swarm had arrived. Chaos erupted throughout the academy. Recruits who had boasted about their combat skills ran screaming through the corridors. Instructors shouted orders that no one followed. The emergency protocols fell apart within minutes as panic spread like a disease. The creatures came through the walls. They were made of living shadow, beings that seemed to exist between darkness and flesh. Their bodies shifted and changed as they moved, never holding the same shape for more than a second. Their mouths opened wide, revealing depths that seemed to go on forever. They did not speak. They did not roar. They simply consumed. Penny watched 3 die in front of her. Their black armor, which they had always been so proud of, meant nothing against creatures that could flow through any gap and strike from any angle. One moment they were fighting, the next they were silent shapes on the floor, their life drained away by the hungry darkness. Penny did not scream. She did not run. She walked toward the creatures. In her hands were weapons she had made herself during her training, a blade fashioned from broken equipment, a torch created from chemical supplies she had gathered over months. She had been preparing for this moment since she was 11 years old. She had known, somewhere deep inside, that the Void Swarm would find her again. They always came back. They had taken everything from her once, and she had spent every day since then getting ready for the chance to face them again. The first creature lunged at her from the shadows. Penny, it with perfect timing, drove her blade into the center of its mass and twisted. The creature screamed, a sound like tearing metal, and dissolved into smoke. She did not stop to watch it die. She was already moving toward the next one. The central courtyard of the academy had become a killing ground. Void creatures poured through breaches in the walls, hunting anything that moved. Bodies lay scattered across the ground, recruits and instructors alike. The survivors had retreated to the inner buildings, barricading themselves behind doors that would not hold for long. Penny walked into the courtyard alone. She began killing. Her movements were precise and economical. No wasted energy, no hesitation. Every strike found its target. Every dodge was exactly enough to avoid the attack and nothing more. She had studied these creatures since childhood. She knew how they moved. She knew where they were weak. She knew that fire hurt them, that certain frequencies of light could slow them down, that their coordination broke apart when their numbers dropped below a certain threshold. She had spent 11 years learning how to destroy them. Now she was putting that knowledge to use. Commander found her 20 minutes later. He had been fighting his way through the academy, trying to reach the command center, when he heard the sounds of combat from the courtyard. What he saw when he arrived made him stop in his tracks. Penny stood in the center of the open space, surrounded by the dissolving remains of at least 30 void creatures. Her clothes were torn and stained with dark fluid that evaporated as it touched the air. Her face was calm. Her eyes were cold. She was not fighting with fear. She was not fighting with rage. She was hunting. Drew his own weapons and moved to stand beside her. Back to back, they faced the swarm together. "You knew," he said between strikes. "You knew they would come eventually." Penny drove her blade through another creature. "They always come back. They killed 12,000 people on my colony, my parents, my brother, everyone I ever knew." She paused to throw her torch at a cluster of creatures, watching them scatter and burn. "I've been waiting for them ever since." More creatures poured into the courtyard, 50, then 100. The swarm was concentrating its forces here, drawn by the violence. Any other being would have been overwhelmed. But Penny and were not any other beings. They fought together with a coordination that should have been impossible. They had never trained as partners, never practiced these movements together, but they understood each other perfectly. Where Penny lacked strength, she had precision. Where she lacked size, she had speed. Where she lacked natural weapons, she had human creativity, the ability to turn anything into a tool of destruction. Was the galaxy's apex predator. He had claws that could cut through steel and reflexes faster than thought, but even he found himself impressed by the tiny human fighting beside him. She gave no ground. She showed no fear. She killed and killed and killed, methodical and relentless. The swarm began to thin. The creatures, sensing that this prey was more dangerous than expected, started to retreat. Penny did not let them. She pursued them across the courtyard, cutting them down one by one, refusing to let any escape. When the reinforcements finally arrived, battle-hardened soldiers from the Galactic Fleet, they found the courtyard covered in the remains of over 200 void creatures. In the center of the carnage stood two figures, an 8-foot covered in wounds that were already healing, and a small human woman who barely reached his chest. Neither of them had a scratch. The soldiers stared in disbelief. They had expected to find a massacre. They had expected to recover bodies and count the dead. Instead, they found two warriors standing triumphant over an enemy that had destroyed entire worlds. One of the soldiers, a veteran of 20 campaigns, looked at Penny and asked the question that everyone was thinking. "How," he whispered, "how is this possible?" Penny met his eyes. Her face was still calm, her breathing already slowing to normal. She looked nothing like a hero. She looked like a small, tired woman who needed a shower. But her eyes told a different story. In them burned a fire that had been lit 11 years ago in the ruins of her colony, a fire that had never gone out. "Practice," she said simply. "Lots of practice." Graduation ceremony took place 1 month after the Void Swarm attack. The academy had been rebuilt. The dead had been honored. The survivors had been evaluated and ranked according to their performance during both the training and the crisis. For the first time in academy history, the traditional final examination had been replaced with a new metric: actual combat performance against a real enemy. The Great Hall was filled with dignitaries from across the galaxy: admirals and generals, ambassadors and senators, representatives from every major species in the Galactic Alliance. They had come to witness the graduation of the class that had survived the worst attack in the Academy's history. They had also come to see the small human woman that everyone was talking about. Penny Moore stood at the front of the class in her new officer's uniform. The uniform had been specially made to fit her small frame. Around her neck, she still wore the teeth from her survival test. No one had asked her to remove them. Behind her stood the other graduates, those who had survived both the training and the attack. There were fewer than half the number that had started. Al was there, his injuries long healed, standing than he ever had before. He no longer laughed at humans. He no longer stepped over anyone. When Penny passed him in the corridors, he nodded to her with genuine respect. The ceremony was long and formal. Speeches were given about courage and sacrifice. The dead were remembered. The future was discussed. Finally, the moment came to announce the rankings. Admiral, who had served in the Galactic Fleet for over 2 centuries, stood at the podium. She read the names of the graduates from lowest to highest rank. The aliens in the crowd expected to hear Penny's name early, at the bottom where a human surely belonged. They were wrong. Name after name was called, and across the stage to receive their certificates. Still Penny stood waiting. The crowd began to whisper. Surely there had been a mistake. Surely the tiny human should have been called by now. When there were only 3 names left, the whispers turned to silence. When there were only 2 names left, the silence turned to disbelief. And when Admiral called out the final name, the name of the recruit who had achieved the highest score in the history of the Academy, no one could speak at all. Penny Moore, the Admiral said, has graduated first in her class with a perfect survival efficiency rating, a score that has never been achieved before. She is hereby granted the rank of lieutenant and assigned to active duty in the Galactic Fleet. Penny walked across the stage. Her footsteps made almost no sound. She stood before the Admiral, received her certificate, and turned to face the crowd. The applause started slowly, just a few hands clapping in the silence. Then it grew. Within seconds, the entire hall was on its feet, cheering for the smallest recruit in Academy history who had proven herself to be the greatest. After the ceremony, there was a formal reception where the graduates mingled with the dignitaries. Most of the conversation centered on Penny, though she herself said little. She stood near a window, looking out at the stars, when Commander approached her. "I have a proposal," he said. Penny turned to look at him. "I'm listening." "In 300 years, I have never taken a hunting partner. I have always worked alone, but I would like you to join me." He paused. "Among my people, this is more than a professional offer. It is an offer of family. It means I will protect you as I would protect my own blood. It means I will teach you everything I know. It means that whatever hunts come, we will face them together." Penny considered this for a long moment. "Why me?" "Because you are what I have been searching for my entire life. A true hunter, a perfect predator." His yellow eyes were warm, something that Penny had never seen before. "And because you deserve to have someone who understands what you are." Before Penny could answer, Admiral approached them. She had been watching from across the room, curious about the legendary's interest in the human. "Commander," she said, "I don't understand. This human is so small, so fragile by galactic standards. Why do you shield her like royalty? Why do you show her such respect?" Looked at the tiny human standing beside him. She was barely more than half his height. Her arms were thin. Her skin was soft. By every physical measure, she was the weakest being in the room. "And yet, let me tell you something about humans," said. His voice was loud enough that others nearby could hear. The conversations around them faded as people listened. They were not given claws or fangs. They have no armor, no venom, no natural weapons of any kind. By all logic, they should have been eaten by the first predator that found them. He paused and looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the alien dignitaries one by one. But they survived, they thrived, they spread across their world and then beyond it. Do you know how? He did not wait for an answer. They learned to make their own claws, their own fangs, their own armor. They learned to think their prey to death. They learned that size means nothing when you understand how to kill. He placed one massive hand on Penny's shoulder. I do not protect her because she is weak. I protect her because humans do not understand their own value. They see their softness as a flaw rather than the fire that forged them into the most adaptable hunters the galaxy has ever seen. His voice dropped lower, but everyone in the room heard him. And because one day, when the great darkness comes for us all, I want humanity standing beside us, not against us. Penny looked up at him. A small smile crossed her face, the first real smile anyone had seen from her since she arrived at the academy. Is that a yes? Asked. Yes, Penny said, partners. The graduation reception continued around them, but something had changed. The aliens who had spent months looking down at the tiny human now looked at her differently. They saw the teeth around her neck. They remembered the stories of her survival test, her training, her stand against the void swarm. They remembered that she had killed more enemies in a single day than most of them would face in their entire careers. They had spent so long measuring worth by size and strength. They had spent so long believing that bigger meant better, that loud meant powerful, that soft meant weak. They had been wrong. Penny Moore was living proof that the most dangerous predator was not always the largest one. Sometimes it was the smallest. Sometimes it was the quietest. Sometimes it was the one that everyone underestimated until it was far too late. The galaxy had learned a valuable lesson that year. Humans were not the fragile creatures they appeared to be. They were survivors. They were adapters. They were hunters who had clawed their way up from nothing and refused to stop climbing. And as Penny stood beside her new partner, looking out at the stars that held both wonders and horrors, she knew that her journey was just beginning. The void swarm was still out there. Other threats lurked in the darkness between worlds. There would be more battles, more hunts, more chances to prove what humans could do. She was ready. She had been ready since she was 11 years old.